Hi there. Let's talk about the culture in African art, Northwest Africa. We've been looking at some art. We've been talking about different cultures, but what exactly do we mean when we talk about culture? What is it? It's one of those words we bandy around, we use all the time, and yet when we really try and unpack what do we mean when we say the word, we've often sort of left with that vague definition. I don't know how to describe it, but I know it when I see it. And that's where we are. What is culture? How does it actually work? What does it do for us? Well, it's true if we look around the world, everyone seems to have culture. There are no people anywhere on this planet who are devoid of culture, because culture is a kind of collective thing. It's what groups of people collectively believe or do. It has to do with symbolic rites that a group of people fall into. And it's one of those things that happens when you're, living at home. Your family you grow up with is got some things they always do for Thanksgiving or whatever the holiday is, or even just any old dinner or any breakfast. There is a way in which things must be done. Food is always controlled by rituals. It's a very common feature of practice. And we'll talk more about rituals later, but today we're going to talk now about this idea of what is underlying these beliefs and practices that we share. And when we start to go out in the world and we begin to experience new things, some people, their values and ideas begin to shift and change. And this is a part of the way in which we grow in the world, is we sort of, our culture seems to be a part of us wherever we go, whatever we do. Now, here I've got a number of nouns: a waffle iron, a coffee cup, popcorn, common cold. Now, these are things. And one of the things we're looking at in art is an object what is culture, and how does an object, a work of art even, represent that idea of culture? But moreover, what are the values of the people who made it, and how do we understand what their culture means to them? Is it much like what we believe? Well, as far as we know, culture has all kinds of different values to different people, and how important it is or unimportant can vary a great deal. One of the common ideas about culture originally was, if it's something everybody has, then we must be something we're born with, right? It's not something that we produce. It's just an idea that is ingrained in us in a very deep way. And it stays with you throughout life. Certain cultures seem to perpetuate each other without much effort at all, or seemingly very little effort. So this idea of a waffle iron is something that, you're kind of pressed into you at birth. And the contours of that are pretty indelible. That there's an awful lot of what we call culture, which is really systemic, the basic elements of who we are and how we think about ourselves in relation to other people. That's sort of the waffle iron theory of culture, that there is this sort of fundamental thing we do collectively in our groups of people that is pretty stable. Now, the coffee cup is a different kind of take on this idea of culture. It says that, we all have a function for culture, but it's more like a container than a thing itself. And you can put all kinds of stuff in that thing. But the fact is, you're looking for ways to fill that thing, and you're going to fill it whatever you want. Like you go to Starbucks, you want your decaf latte, or you want your frappuccino, it's going to go into your coffee cup. Whatever that container is doesn't matter, as much as that there's a place for us to put those values and ideas that we collectively call culture. So the coffee cup says, really, it changes a lot. There is no fundamental stability there in that. Another theory that is sort of mixture of these two is the idea of popcorn. Well, we're born with some things, and experience changes us to other kinds of ideas. So in the popcorn theory, some kernels pop, what we're born with comes into being, because of the experiences of our childhood and adulthood. And then, of course, in popcorn, there's always a few kernels that don't pop, right? And that's sort of the idea that not everything we're born with comes into being. But we are born with things, but they don't always manifest themselves in our lives. Another interesting theory is not to think of it as something physical or something we're born with necessarily, but something that is kind of infecting us. Like we come into contact with something and we really don't have a lot of control over what we choose. It's like we experience something in our environment and it consumes us. And we define ourselves by those ideologies. The common cold is like that. We don't choose to get a common cold. You can't hardly even go out and try and find it, but it will find you in due time. And so like culture, it is something that kind of infects us. And culture is not necessarily a good thing. It not necessarily is a positive thing. We can talk about a culture that is, the basis of everything from fascism to racism. These are things that culture can breed and perpetuate. Or crazy things like Beanie Babies or pet rocks or all these obsessions. These are things that cultures, or female genital mutilation. These are things that cultures define. And they have a very difficult time to get rid of. And there are a lot of people who are, suffer because of what we call collectively as culture. So I take the common cold approach mostly because I feel that we have to be wary about what we allow to infect us, but we may not have a lot of control over it once it does. And it's part of the sort of dynamic and fluid nature of this thing called culture, that we can't collectively think of it as a stable, unified thing, but that's something that has very deliberate and structures within a society that infect some people more than others. So in today's lecture, I want to talk about the Bamana people and later the Snufo people. Bamana we were talking about Timbuktu and Jene in Mali. We're going to talk more about the Bamana people, who also are a little bit further to the west and south in the country of Mali. The Bamana people, to begin with, have these clans within the society, and the people identify with their clan. The clan is work-related. If you're a farmer and your father was a farmer, you're born into this clan of farmers. And the way they celebrate their identity as, people who till the soil and work as farmers, they have special rites during important planting seasons and harvesting that come with this idea. This is the Chiwara, which is the symbolic ancestral farmer, the deity that came in and taught farming to people and is there to encourage people to work hard and till the soil and generate the goods that the society depends on. Chiwara are what we call crown masks. So they are wooden sculptures that literally just rest on the head, and they're sort of strapped in place with a kind of a basket. And then the person wearing this crown then is covered completely in a kind of raffia cloth that disguises the general shape and character of their upper body, though exposing their arms and a little bit of their legs. The Chiwara headdresses are done by champion farmers at times of land clearing, plowing, planting, and harvest. The dance is done in a bent-over attitude to show an excellent farmer hows the ground continually without straightening up to rest. The performance is hoped to aid the farmer's efforts to make something out of nothing, growing crops from the dry ground. So we see here what's called the vertical style. This has this sort of tall antelope look. The antelope deity was believed to paw the ground. Its horns are supposed to be like the nature of the plows that they use. You see in this historic picture the way that the animals are operating the ground. Also, as you saw in the previous picture, there are really two chihuahua. They come in pairs. There's a male chihuahua and there's a female chihuahua. And the chihuahua sometimes have, a female chihuahua will sometimes have a child with it. And the vertical style, as I showed earlier, this is one of the more common styles that you see when it comes to chihuahua. There are a number of different other styles. Depending on the groups, they may have various alternatives of this idea of the ancestor farmer. One is called the horizontal style, which is found more in the north of the river Niger. And you see here, the antelope is not entirely an antelope. It's starting to morph into actually as part chameleon. And this idea of a creature, animal of multiple forms. We also see sort of holding on to the horns of the plow. We see the female figure, this idea of fertility, the plow and the horns associated with the idea of digging and plowing the earth, a kind of sexual metaphor for kind of bringing fertility to the land. A third type of chihuahua can be found in this sort of abstract style from the Burgundy region, southwest Bamana. In this case here, it's in multiple different forms of animals, sort of abstractly related to each other. It has the sort of tall horns of the vertical style, but then it has other shapes and designs that it sort of suggest different kinds of animals. Here we see something like an anteater snout used for rooting in the earth. And so there are lots of different kinds of abstract chihuahua that can appear to kind of morph between different kinds of animals. You'll also notice how the legs are bent. The bent legs at the base here signify this idea of mobility, springing, jumping, some kind of activity. Here is the vertical style again. And in this case here in the metal, attachments on the male are said to give the mask D, a sweetness and tastiness, a kind of special honor and a special kind of status. Seldom used, though often reproduced for tourists, are what they call the little antelope heads. These figures are now, mostly relegated to museums. Like a lot of culture in Africa, as we've moved more and more into the modern world, many of these ancient dances and traditional ways are really there in large part to be performed for tourists, to be sold to tourists, but they don't actually play a very important role in the people of the here and the now. Another very important clan in the Bamana people in Mali are the Nyamakala clan, who are the blacksmiths. They are a very tight-knit clan. They are people you're born into it. The secret technology that people must learn very early on about forging and smelting and making these sacred objects, iron objects, is a very hard-won technology. And anytime there is a kind of sort of extraordinary achievement, such as, making hard metal out of clays and rocks and the raw elements of the earth, there is a kind of magic that is associated with it. The blacksmiths have very important status within the society for their powers to be able to make this. Their knowledge is considered both sacred and necessary, but also dangerous. They meant to live separately. They marry among each other so that their secrets remain closed within the community. Now I'll talk about another group in Mali in the south, and this is a rather remote group in this area along these cliffs called this escarpment called the Bandiangara escarpment. And the Dogon have lived there for many centuries. They're not the first inhabitants to live here. They believe they came in and took this over from the Telem, who are an older people that lived here before them. But in this region, they have lived there, and they are not Muslim. And they tend to keep their sort of secret society and their own practices very much kind of within themselves, and they maintain some very ancient rituals. This is why a lot of people come to them to learn about them, is that they seem to represent a kind of older social order. You see their homes here are built really right in amongst the cliff dwellings. This is a very poor, dry part of Mali that requires an enormous amount of work to sustain people. The Dogon have a meeting house called the Toguna, and the wood they use, these very large trees, are cut and shaped, and the crook of the tree is used to support this massive canopy of cut raffia piled up, and this creates a kind of shelter for the men to gather. These large pillars that are used to support the structure are often carved with symbols of fertility of men and women, and as part of the kind of rites of passage and that are associated with these men's societies that gather within the Toguna. The Toguna pillars have become, unfortunately, a big area of interest in museums around the world, and there's been an awful lot of theft of these statues, people coming in and destroying the Dogon's meeting houses so that they can steal these objects. In this picture here, we see a men's meeting house where they have literally chopped off the features of their own art on their pillars to prevent people from wanting to steal them. This is the only way they knew how to keep their men's meeting house intact. The Dogon, of course, are very famous for their masquerades. They have a number of them that have used in funeral rites that appear traditionally rather infrequently. When a number of people had died, they are to lead the spirits up into the heavens, as hence they have this idea of a sky deity and returning to the sky. These super tall wooden masks are meant to reference the kind of this serpent that kind of connects the ground to the earth. And a lot of the kind of dance rituals have this idea of kind of orienting the sky and the earth. Dogon rituals today also have a kind of humor and parody in them. Here you see this one masquerader is wearing a white cowrie shell mask, false breasts, and tall stilts. In this, he's making fun of Fulani women who are very light-skinned and tall. And so this is their way of kind of making fun of the Fulani, who are very wealthy people who live down in the valley. One of the things that the Dogon have is a way of kind of making things that they, of course, live in this very impoverished area. They don't really have a concept of art for art's sake. Everything is mako dilang yiru, wood carvings that fix needs. Objects have a very specific function. Now, in this case here, you're looking at a door lock, and the way the door lock works is that you have to push and pull and shift it in a very specific way. You can't just open the door. The lock is latched in a kind of by a secret mechanism hidden within the box. And this is a way in which the Dogon door lock kind of keeps only those people who know how to move the bar accurately to open the door. It also is not just a simple door lock. It is imbued, as the Dogon believe, with a certain magical properties as well. And that's like the people who are mask carvers, like the blacksmiths. They have a certain skills, they have certain technologies and knowledge that allows them access to these kind of magical abilities. So the door lock not only is there to keep the door shut for only certain people, but it also has certain charms and symbols that are meant to dissuade anyone who is not supposed to enter from entering. Here is we were talking about the Fulani, but also in the area in this region of Mali, there's also the Hausa in Nigeria, and they wear a very important piece of clothing called the babariga. They are Muslim, unlike that. And you'll see here in this large clothing, this amazing embroidery that they have that allows them to sort of draw like drawing, but it's actually just sort of stitched into the fabric. This is a very important design called the 8 knives pattern. You see 5 pointing down and then 3 around the neck, which are sort of symbolic of protection to the person wearing the garment. I show you this as to clarify that some people who want to compare this from the Dogon Mali, the mud painted cloth, you can see is much simpler and has a kind of gray and brown pattern, which is dyed from a cotton fabric and a much more basic technology of weaving.